On this episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show, we talk about how we work with athletes with hypermobility.
The Ask Mike Reinold Show. Helping people feel better, move better, and perform better.
Welcome back, everybody, to the latest episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show. We're up at Champion PT and Performance up in Boston, Mass. Lenny, Dave, Dan, and Mike, 3 students behind us. Cam, what do we have for a question? We're kind of running out of time.
Well, what students do we have? We have Janice Conkle from New York Medical College, Leanne Cologne from Texas Women's University, and Cameron McDonald from URI.
Boom! Squeezing one more episode in today. Cam, what do we got for an amazing episode today?
So we have Malia from Waltham.
Malia. Right?
Malia, right?
Probably Malia.
Malia.
Okay. Malia, sorry.
It's maybe
Okay.
She writes, I'm curious about your thoughts on managing the patient with hypermobility, specifically those female athletes with generalized hypermobility who tend to prefer dance, gymnastics, silks, or circus arts. I'm finding joint damage and injuries like labral tears, sprains, and dislocations in these athletes. I would love to hear your thoughts on recovery time expectations, exercises, and return to sport guidelines.
All right, so great question, Malia. I appreciate that. You know what struck me about this question is Malia said she's from Waltham.
Yeah.
So we're in Waltham, Mass, and we always say Boston. So it's funny. So Malia, you should just come here and ask us. Come hang out. Just lunch. So I'm fully expecting you to follow up with us and figure out a time you want to come hang out for 10 minutes because we want to come talk to you in person. If you're actually from Waltham, let's talk. I mean, we welcome everybody to come
Waltham,
visit
like
us.
Missouri,
So,
probably.
right, she didn't put a state, so I assumed it was Waltham, Massachusetts, like as if we knew, right? But seriously, Malia, come see us, and then we'll film it and everybody gets to see it. But anyway, all right. So hypermobile athlete. Great question because she's seeing all these loose jointed people with all these injuries. Dave, you want to start this off? Dave and I recorded a podcast episode. Was that for you or for me? I don't even remember. It was for me. It was one of my videos from my inner circle. Dave and I talked about hypermobile athletes, but hypermobile athletes get injuries, and it's probably because they end up doing too much all the time. We kind of say that quite a bit. So Dave, what's your thoughts? So start this off a little bit. How do you manage your hypermobile athletes?
Yeah, so I think it's really good to probably just take a general kind of bullet point approach, kind of like the main topic to hit on versus diving in super deep. But number one is always education, right? These athletes are definitely in need of education about why they're super mobile, like from a joint level, right? They have more collagen tissue, they have, passive structures are more lax versus they might need more soft tissue management instead of just stretching, right? So I think that's always a huge kind of eye-opener for the athletes that we see is like, you can get a lot of range of motion for the wrong reasons. You can still be soft tissue stiffness with adaptive stretching out of your joint capsules. And I see that a lot of, especially in hips, right? Athletes don't understand. They feel tight, but they are loose in the same point because they've probably done a lot of stretching on their capsular tissues and they don't understand that you can still have quad soft tissue stiffness or adductor soft tissue stiffness. So that's always like number one is education and communicating about like, why they got to you in the first place. I think two is always just trying to really harp on the amount of work and patience that's required to develop strength, right? These athletes are typically have no problem with full range of motion. It's not something they had to work on. It's just like, they were born with mobility, but on the other side of the spectrum, they have to work very hard to gain strength to build dynamic stability and strength. So that's like, okay, well, this is going to be a 5 to 6 plus month process. This is not going to be like, in an unmobile athlete, sometimes you do some interventions and they like, oh, I feel pretty good. I move pretty well. On the opposite side of the coin, we say, well, some people are born super stiff and they don't need problems with building strength, but mobility work is a day-to-day process. They have to work on that every single day. So understanding the differences there of the timeline is really important. And I think the third thing for me personally is always trying to make sure that you're specific to what their needs and their sport is, right? The way that you guys gain shoulder ER, I would never try to chase in a gymnast because they don't require that much layback. But in a swimmer, if they do butterfly stroke, it might be completely different. If they're a dancer or a contortionist or a circus person, they do completely unique things, right? So within the subset of sports, you have hypermobile athletes, but even within that, there's like 7 different branches of unique sports that if you're trying to treat a gymnast like a baseball player like a swimmer, you're going to completely miss the boat and you're going to probably lose them because you're giving them the wrong thing.
So I was trying to count how many times you took a breath, in all honesty, and I was wondering what your O2 stat was.
Right? 96 pulse ox.
I was like, that went from 99 to like down to 93 over the course
Good
of the
lung capacity. Chris Hinshaw.
Pretty solid. So obviously, amazing answer. I think you nailed it, right? I mean, we could probably end the episode right there. I mean, just very thorough kind of concept. That's how you have to think of hypermobile athletes. You have to think of it from that perspective. What do you guys want to add? Anybody?
I agree to disagree. Stretching is appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. We get kids that come in that mid-teen that's always been told they were tight, so they've been stretching a ton, but in fact they are probably just got hypermobility and they perceive that they feel tight, but they're not tight. If you look at their joints and you kind of isolate the joint and look at muscle length for that particular joint, they're not truly tight. And I get a couple examples right now of kids that I'm seeing actively right now that were told by the doc and the previous physical therapist, you got to stretch, and then I look and I'm not seeing the tightness issue that they described. So I think it's a perception of being tight, probably because it's an overuse, it's a volume issue, and the muscle is fatigued out and gets tight, and maybe gives a signal to the brain that it needs a break, and that's the signal that you're getting is you're tight, so you're trying to stretch it, and it's this cycle. And nobody's ever really introduced basic concepts of strength training, basic stuff, especially for a 15-year-old, just to kind of get them acclimated to strength training and then really ramp up their program and then focus on sports volume along with their exercise that they're doing. And I think it's when those worlds collide for that person, they feel completely differently for the hypermobile person,
Absolutely, yeah.
Sometimes it can be like an addition by subtraction kind of treatment style where you take out some things like maybe like aggressive static stretching or aggressive manual therapy techniques, and they start to feel a little bit better, and then you build strength onto that.
Yeah.
So that's something you consider
It's
as well.
funny. Dave and I, we talk about this all the time. It seems like the more flexible you are, like his gymnasts that can like put their knee to their face with the hamstring stretch, are the ones that always say they're tight. They always say I feel tight.
Just because you can
Right.
doesn't mean you should.
So they right. So they stretch to again get that feeling in the mechanoreceptors to try to stimulate a little stretch. So what did you have some, Dan? Sorry.
Just something to add real quick, and I see this a lot. Maybe it's just my population, so I'm not working with a lot of like ballet dancers, that type of thing. They tend to be globally hypermobile. I see a lot of people that are tight in one area and then not so much in another, and they get labeled like, oh, I'm hypermobile or I'm really stiff. And like, well, you're not stiff here, but you are stiff here.
Right.
So maybe do some stretches here, but don't stretch this. This thing doesn't need to be stretched.
Right. Be more specific.
Yeah, be more specific. So,
Yeah.
And
I like that.
Relative
Adaptation to the
instability is a huge thing, right? Like low back pain in most hypermobile athletes is because something else is not moving well.
Right.
So you have one area, like Dan said, that moves a ton to make up for above and below. Like clearly spend more time around the issue.
Right. I mean, I hate to label all athletes like this, but I think it's actually fairly close. I think most sports, right, there's eccentric cumulative trauma that happens from the sport.
Sure.
No matter almost whatever it is, swinging, throwing, rotating, cartwheeling, like anything you may do, there's always
Curveballing.
there's some sort of eccentric cumulative trauma that happens. So one of my philosophies that we do quite a bit with our athletes that are especially our hypermobile athletes is we never ever torque the joint first. And that's opposite of what you guys learn in school quite a bit. Sometimes it depends on the school and the philosophy, but sometimes they say they address the joint first and then soft tissue second. That's some schools' thought process, right? So for me, we don't address the joint first. We do soft tissue first because we think any loss of motion is probably from that eccentric cumulative trauma. So we're very soft tissue based there at Champion because we deal with mostly athletes. So we never torque a joint before we first work the soft tissue. What happens is athletes a lot of times with their self-care, they end up trying to torque the joint and the concept of relative stiffness comes about. And what happens is whatever area is tight stays tight and whatever area is mobile becomes hypermobile because that's the path of least resistance in the body, right? So that's kind of how we put it together. So my key for almost all our athletes is we don't torque joints. We gain our mobility by addressing the soft tissue, and then we work on dynamic stability. And I think if you don't do those three things, you end up kind of missing the boat with most of your athletes, especially your hypermobile athletes. There's always going to be stiff people that play sports, right, that are still good at sports. But I think a lot of people are hypermobile with eccentric cumulative trauma on top of it. So, good. So another great episode. I think that's a good one because I think we all see hypermobile athletes a lot, right? And if you don't see them completely generalized laxity throughout the body, like the question was saying, even some like, circ and gymnasts and dancers and type of thing, you'll probably still see it, like Dan said, in certain areas. So I think you got to apply that concept, to whoever it may be in front of you and whatever area of the body you're working with. So great question. Head to MikeReinold.com, click on that podcast link, and you can fill out the form to ask us more questions like this. And be sure to go to iTunes to review, rate, and subscribe, and we'll see you on a future episode. Thank you so much.